Chapter 3. The Taste of Copper. The wastes did not possess a geography of straight lines. In the archive, space had been as quantifiable as currency, bounded by stone arches, squared desks, and the reliable, predictable width of a leather-bound ledger. Out here, the earth rolled away in fractured, asymmetric ripples of slate-grey shale and wind-bitten scrub. It was an agonizing expanse of negative space, an unstructured wilderness that stripped the mind of its traditional metrics and left it exposed to the sky. We had been walking since the bruised violet light of dawn had dissolved into a pale, featureless noon. My boots, designed for the smooth marble floors of Dawnspire's inner sanctums, had split across the instep. Every stride across the loose shale sent a jarring shock up my shins, a dull, thumping reminder of my physical fragility. The world without the entity's immediate presence was a slow, agonizing grind against friction. Behind me, the rhythmic, metallic clink of Kaelen's chainmail provided a small, desperate tether to sanity. Clink-shh! Clink-shh! It was a rhythmic pulse, a clumsy substitute for the mechanical grace of the clock tower I had left behind. "You're dragging your left heel, Torin," Kaelen observed. His voice was low, carrying that familiar, grounded gravity that usually steadied my racing thoughts. He stepped up beside me, his broad shoulder lightly brushing mine. "We can halt by the dry creek bed. The sun is at its peak, and you look like you're breathing dust." "I am functional," I replied. My voice sounded thin, lacking the resonant authority I used to project from the pulpit. I adjusted the strap of my pack, acutely aware of the weight of the Chronicle of Oaths pressing against my spine. Every hour we waste idling in the open is an hour the Tribunal's scouts use to close the distance between us. "The scouts won't find us if we drop dead of dehydration first," Elara muttered from a few paces ahead. She had paused on a limestone shelf, her slender frame partially concealed by the shadow of a dead juniper tree. Her fingers played idly with the silver hilt of her hidden blade, a twitchy, restless habit that matched the constant, suspicious darting of her amber eyes. "The wastes swallow tracks, High Cleric, but they also swallow people who don't know when to sit down." I halted, my breath rattling uncomfortably in my dry throat. When the entity within me was dormant, the world felt agonizingly heavy. The atmosphere was thick with the scent of sun-baked dust, bitter sage, and the faint, sulphurous tang of the mineral crust coating the rocks. It was a completely physical world, raw, coarse, and painfully real. Without the divine fuel of the entity, my body felt like a rusted clockwork mechanism with its mainspring winding down to a dead stop. My knees throbbed. The skin on my face felt parched and stretched tight. "Very well," I conceded, unbuckling my waterskin with trembling fingers. 10 minutes. Kaelen dropped his heavy pack with a dull thud, immediately turning his attention to me. He reached out, his calloused hand steadying my arm as I slid down onto a flat stone. "Drink," he commanded softly, handing me a small strip of dried salt meat. I forced myself to chew. The meat tasted like ash, requiring an immense effort of will just to swallow. I watched Kaelen as he sat across from me, unscrewing his own canteen. He didn't drink immediately. Instead, he used a damp cloth to wipe the grime from his brow, his movements deliberate, unhurried, and precise. He was an island of absolute order in this lawless waste, a man bound by vows that didn't shift with the terrain. I loved him for that unyielding stability. He was the one piece of my old life that still retained its meaning. Yet, a growing, terrible part of me hated him for it. His presence was a constant accusation, a silent reminder of the logical, orderly man I was systematically destroying. "You're thinking about the archive," Kaelen said quietly, his eyes searching my face. "I'm thinking about the ledger entries," I confessed, leaning my head back against the cold limestone. The simple arithmetic, the comfort of knowing that if a column balances, the universe is correct. Out here, there are no columns, no margins. "There's us," Kaelen said firmly, reaching out to touch my knee. "We are the sequence, Torin. We carry the law of Dawnspire within us, even if the city walls are out of sight." A sequence of rotting bone, a cold, distinct thought echoed in the back of my mind. The transition was instantaneous. The entity didn't wake with a roar. It expanded like ink dropping into a glass of clear water. The coarse smell of the dry sagebrush vanished, instantly replaced by a sharp, artificial scent of ozone and the heavy, cloying sweetness of decaying white lilies. The air around us grew dense, pressing against my eardrums until the sound of Kaelen's voice became distorted, as if he were speaking to me through several feet of dark water. I tensed, my fingers digging into the limestone until the rock bit into my skin. The physical pain was distant now, muffled by the abstract electric current beginning to thrum behind my teeth. "Look at the horizon, Torin," the patron whispered, its tone like silk dragging over broken glass. "The variables are approaching. The balance must be corrected." I blinked, and my vision shifted into a terrifying dual perspective. I could still see Kaelen's worried eyes, but superimposed over him was a shifting latticework of glowing, golden threads, the delicate, fragile, structural lines of reality. And just beyond the ridge, descending from the northern foothills, another pattern emerged, a slow-moving cluster of rough, irregular shapes, a supply caravan. They were refugees or traders from the lower borders, their wooden wagons creaking under the weight of grain sacks and dried provisions. I could see the golden threads of their lives tangled with the heavy, unmoving law of the tribunal. They were a small node of order, attempting to survive in the wild. "They carry the old structure," the entity murmured, its presence sliding down my spine like a column of dry ice. "They are transporting sustenance to the border garrisons of the Radiant Tribunal. If that food arrives, the gears of the cage will turn for another turn. The sequence must falter. Snap the springs." "No," I whispered aloud, my human heart hammering against my ribs in a sudden, desperate panic. These were innocent people, farmers, merchants, families fleeing the very stagnation I had run from. I didn't want to hurt them. I wanted to protect the weak. That was the core vow of the sanctification I had spent my youth learning. "Torin, what do you see?" Kaelen was on his feet instantly, his hand dropping to the hilt of his great sword, his eyes tracking the direction of my vacant stare. "There is a caravan," I forced myself to report, my voice caught in that horrifying, fractured middle ground, intellectual but brittle. 600 yards out, coming down the ravine. Elara slid down from her perch, her eyes narrowing as she looked over the lip of the ridge. "He's right. 6 wagons. Light guard. Maybe 4 men with tribunal spears. They're sluggish, dragging their feet." "We hide," Kaelen said immediately, his instinct for tactical preservation taking over. "We let them pass. We have no quarrel with merchants, and we can't afford a skirmish." "A quarrel?" The entity's voice surged, becoming louder, more electric, completely obliterating my internal monologue. "This is not a quarrel. This is a harvest. The famine in the eastern provinces is a necessity, Torin. It is a pruning of the dead wood. If you let them feed the garrison, you are rebuilding the walls of your own prison. Turn the grain to ash. Break the circle. We cannot let them pass," I said. The words left my mouth with an unnatural, chilling finality, completely detached from my internal screaming. I stood up, my body moving without my consent, my legs rigid and precise as clockwork. Kaelen stepped in front of me, his massive chest blocking my path. Torin, think about what you are saying. Those are civilians. There is no strategic value in attacking a supply line. They are the fuel for the machine, Kaelen, I said, my eyes wide and entirely unblinking. To my own ears, my voice sounded like a chorus of two voices speaking in perfect, unsettling unison. One high and human, the other deep, resonant, and dead. If the garrison is fed, the law remains stable. We are here to ensure the world can move again. Move aside. I won't let you murder innocents, Kaelen said, his face turning pale with an absolute, heartbroken resolve. He didn't draw his sword against me, but he stood firm, his boots dug into the shale. He is friction, the patron whispered, a sudden, hot current of wildfire flooding my chest. Shatter the variable. No! My soul shrieked from its dark corner. With an unnatural, violent speed, my hand lashed out. I didn't strike Kaelen. My fingers clamped onto the air itself, twisting as if grasping an invisible lever. The golden threads of reality running through the air before us groaned. The entity's power tore through my arm, a torrent of liquid purple fire that erupted from my palm. The energy didn't hit Kaelen directly. I fought with every ounce of my remaining humanity to pull my hand to the left. But the concussive force struck the ground beneath his feet. The solid shale didn't just break, it unwound. The rocks dissolved into a boiling, chaotic violet slurry of liquefied stone and raw, crackling heat. Kaelen bellowed in shock as the ground gave way beneath him, sending him tumbling down the side of the ravine into a cloud of hissing, white smoke. "Kaelen!" Elara screamed, leaping back as the purple flame whipped past her cloak. But my body was already moving forward, gliding down the slope toward the unsuspecting caravan with a terrifying, weightless momentum. The world around me had completely lost its physical dimensions. I didn't see wagons. I saw a collection of geometric shapes that needed to be dissolved. I didn't see the terrified faces of the drivers as they looked up, and saw a man descending upon them with hands dripping with liquid shadow. I raised both hands. The entity inside me sang, a high, beautiful, and deafening frequency that filled my head with the music of dead stars. "Unmake," it commanded. The purple fire cascaded from my fingers, washing over the lead wagon. The wood didn't burn with normal flame. It melted, the iron hoops holding the canvas cover warping into liquid spirals that hissed as they hit the soil. The enormous sacks of grain burst open, but the wheat didn't spill. It charred instantly into a dense, oily black ash that floated upward into the sky like a cloud of dead insects. The horses screamed, their harnesses snapping as the leather straps disintegrated into dust. The guards thrust their tribunal spears at me, but as the steel points entered the aura of violet light around my body, the metal softened, twisting into useless, metallic ribbons that fell harmlessly into the dirt. I was a god. I was an apex predator, rewriting the law of the valley. Then, through the roar of the celestial static, a human sound pierced the veil. A child's voice, crying out from the back of the second wagon, terrified and small. The sound was a spike driven through my brain. It was an absolute validation of the world I was destroying. I remembered the archive. I remembered the quiet chapel where I used to comfort the grieving. I remembered who I was. With a desperate, agonizing scream that tore my vocal cords, I wrenched my hands upward, forcing the remaining torrent of divine energy into the empty sky. The sky didn't absorb the magic. It fractured, A sonic boom of pure, discordant purple lightning ripped through the low clouds, leaving a jagged, smoking scar across the sky, before the entity suddenly, violently snapped shut. The withdrawal was like being dropped from a tower. My knees didn't just bend, they gave out entirely, slamming into the jagged, half-melted stone with a sickening jar. The purple light vanished instantly, plunging the ravine back into the harsh, glaring reality of the desert sun. The holy hangover arrived with the devastating weight of an absolute collapse. It began in my chest, a hollow, sucking vacuum that felt as though my lungs had been lined with dry sand and set on fire. Every gasp for air was a brutal, rattling negotiation with my throat. A thick, heavy taste of copper flooded my mouth, so intense and metallic that it made my stomach heave with a violent wave of nausea. It was the literal taste of my own vitality being consumed by the entity, leaving only the bitter residue of ash on my tongue. My vision was a ruined ledger, blurry, dark at the margins, and flickering with erratic spots of grey static. I tried to raise my right hand, but it refused the command. The skin of my fingers was pale, translucent, and cold as river ice. The fingertips stained a deep, bruised violet that wouldn't wash away. Every muscle in my torso began to spasm in rhythmic, uncontrollable waves, a cold, greasy sweat breaking out across my brow despite the blistering heat of the canyon. I rolled onto my side in the dirt, curling my knees toward my chest in a desperate attempt to contain the shivering that threatened to shake my teeth loose from my skull. I felt shrunken, hollowed out, a pathetic, leaking vessel that had dared to hold the ocean. "Torin!" The sound of boots scrambling over loose shale was distant, muffled by the loud, ringing hiss in my ears. I lay in the muck, unable to lift my head as Kaelen's shadow finally fell over me. He was covered in grey soot and mud from the ravine floor, his silver-woven tunic torn at the shoulder. But he was alive. He dropped to his knees beside me, his large hands hesitating for a fraction of a second before gripping my shoulders with a desperate, trembling force. "Look at me, Torin. Talk to me." His voice cracked, raw with a terrifying mixture of anger and panic. He turned me onto my back, his eyes scanning my shaking frame. I couldn't form words. I could only choke on the copper fluid in my throat, a pathetic, wet gasp escaping my lips. "He's shivering," Elara said, her voice dropping all its usual sarcasm. She stood a few feet away, her eyes wide as she looked past us at the smoking ruin of the lead wagon. The merchant family had managed to unhitch their remaining horses and were fleeing back down the canyon, abandoning their ruined livelihoods to the smoke. She looked down at me, her fingers still resting on her blades, but her posture was rigid with an uncharacteristic horror. "Kaelen, look at his eyes. The pupils, they aren't round anymore. They're like fractures." "Shut up, Elara. Help me get him upright," Kaelen snapped, hauling my upper body off the stones. The movement triggered a blinding spike of vertigo that made the canyon walls tilt violently on their axis. I clutched at Kaelen's leather bracer, my fingers weak and trembling like an old man's. The familiar smell of his sweat and old leather tried to anchor me, but the sweet, rotting scent of lilies still hovered in my nostrils, a persistent reminder of the parasite coiled in my mind. I'm here," I finally rasped, the words feeling like shards of glass cutting my throat. I wiped my mouth with the back of my hand, leaving a dark smudge of copper-flavored blood on my pale skin. "Kaelen, I didn't want to strike you." Kaelen didn't answer immediately. He helped me lean against a high boulder, his movements efficient, but entirely devoid of the warmth he had shown just an hour prior. He stood up, stepping back a pace, his hand resting heavily on the pommel of his sword. His face was a mask of cold, hard stone. "You didn't strike me, Torin," he said, his voice flat, dangerously quiet. "But you destroyed that wagon. You turned a season's harvest into poison ash. If you hadn't pulled that fire away at the last second, you would have killed that child." "The entity," I began, my intellectual voice failing me, leaving me sounding small and desperate. It saw a pattern. It argued that the food was fuel for the tribunal garrison. It was trying to break the sequence. "I don't care about the sequence," Kaelen roared, the sudden explosion of his voice causing my throbbing head to spike with agony. He stepped closer, leaning down until his eyes were inches from mine. "I care about men. I care about the vows we took to protect the innocent. You fused armor into a bandit's chest yesterday, Torin. Today you burn provisions for starving people. That isn't a perspective shift. That is madness." I looked away from him, unable to bear the absolute rightness of his fury. He was completely correct. From any sane, human framework, my actions were those of a monster. The entity's logic was an icy, mathematical geometry that had no room for individual suffering or mercy. It only saw the macrocosm, the grand design that required total unmaking before anything new could grow. "Maybe," I whispered, the words slipping past my blooded teeth before my intellect could halt them. "Maybe the old framework is the monster, Kaelen. Maybe everything we think is good is just the rust that keeps the world from turning." Kaelen recoiled as if he had been stung, his expression shifting from anger to a profound, hollow grief. "That is the god speaking, Torin, not you." "He is wrong," the patron chanted from the darkness of my skull, its voice a low, comforting vibration that actually eased the pain in my temples. "It is you. You are the one who opened the door. You are the one who saw that the cage was small. He is just a prisoner who has grown to love his chains." "We need to move," Elara interrupted, her voice sharp as she pointed toward the ridge. "The smoke from that wagon is going to draw every border patrol within 10 leagues. If we stay here debating theology, we'll all be balancing the tribunal's books from inside a dungeon." Kaelen stared at me for 3 more agonizing seconds, his hand still hovering over his blade. I could see the internal struggle in the rigid line of his jaw. He was a man of oaths, and he had sworn to follow me. But I had just broken the very foundation of the law he lived by. For a terrifying moment, I truly believed he was going to draw his steel and end the tragedy right there. Part of me, the old Torin, the cleric who loved order, wanted him to do it. Instead, he turned his back on me, grabbing his pack from the dirt. "Get up, Torin," he said, his voice completely devoid of emotion. "We head into the lower canyon. If your patron can leave you your legs, I suggest you use them." I forced my trembling limbs to cooperate, dragging myself up using the boulder for support. My joints popped, and a wave of nausea nearly forced me back to my knees. But I stood. I reached into my bag, my fingers brushing against the cold leather of the Chronicle of Oaths. It felt like dead weight now, inert and silent, its temporary hunger satisfied by the destruction of the wagon. We walked into the deepening shadows of the lower canyon in absolute silence. The sun began to slip behind the jagged shale peaks, casting long, distorted shadows that seemed to point toward the abyssal gate ahead. I looked at Kaelen's broad back, then at Elara, sliding through the brush to our right, and a terrible, suffocating realization settled into my chest. I wasn't their leader anymore. I was a disease they were carrying, a ticking mechanism of cosmic chaos that they couldn't abandon, and couldn't cure. The taste of copper remained on my tongue, thick and permanent, a reminder that every step forward on this path was paid for with a piece of my own soul. The gorge narrowed as the last vestiges of daylight bled from the sky. The walls of towering limestone rose precipitously on either side, blocking out the stars and trapping us in a dark, humid corridor that smelled intensely of stagnant water and cold iron. The heat of the day had vanished, replaced by a sudden, unnatural draft that chilled the sweat-soaked fabric of my traveling leathers. Every step was an exercise in pure mechanical discipline. My muscles, still recovering from the violent convulsions of the holy hangover, throbbed with a rhythmic, dull ache that seemed to align with the pulsing of my veins. My mind was analytical enough to recognize the symptoms of physical exhaustion, but the spark required to change my condition was missing. I was functioning on momentum alone, a clockwork soldier running down the last turns of its spring. Ahead of us, Elara stopped suddenly, raising a hand. Her silhouette was barely visible against the dark mouth of a cavern that branched off from the main path. "The canyon floor opens up into a dry basin about a mile ahead," she said, her voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "But there's a tribunal watchtower perched right on the lip. If they have a lantern lit, they'll spot us the moment we break cover. We need to stay in the shadows of this cave until the moon passes behind the ridge." Kaelen nodded once, a brief, silent gesture of agreement. He didn't look at me as he unbuckled his pack and lowered it carefully to the stone floor. His silence was heavier than the stone walls around us, a dense, unyielding wall of disapproval that made the air feel thin. "I will take the first watch," Kaelen said to Elara, his voice carefully controlled, flat and professional. "You rest. We move the moment the shadow hits the basin." "And him?" Elara asked, tilting her chin toward me. She sat cross-legged against the cave wall, her daggers resting across her knees. Her amber eyes gleamed in the darkness, watching me with that same predatory curiosity that had defined her since we left Dawnspire. "Is he going to sleep, or is he going to have another revelation?" "Torin will remain here," Kaelen said, still refusing to look in my direction. He stepped toward the mouth of the cavern, his hand resting on the hilt of his great sword, his frame filling the opening like a sentinel. I slid down the cold wall, my knees clicking loudly in the quiet cave. The stone was smooth, lacking the rough, chaotic texture of the shale hills outside. For a moment, the dark enclosure felt familiar. It resembled the lower vaults of the archive where the forbidden texts were kept, places where the air was old and undisturbed by the wind. I leaned my head back, closing my eyes, desperate for a moment of genuine human silence. But the silence was an illusion. The moment my eyes closed, the low, rhythmic hum of the entity began to vibrate in the base of my skull. It wasn't a sudden intrusion this time. It was a steady, persistent frequency, like the purr of a massive animal sleeping beside me. The scent of ozone flared lightly in my nostrils, accompanied by the cold, metallic taste of copper that had settled permanently into the back of my throat. "The night is afraid," the patron murmured, its voice drifting through my thoughts like smoke through a lattice. "He watches the darkness, but he does not see the pattern. He thinks the law can protect him from the storm. He does not understand that the storm is the law." "Be quiet," I thought back, using every ounce of my intellectual will to force the presence down into the deeper layers of my mind. "He is right to fear. We almost killed a child." "A child is a point on a line," the voice countered, its tone completely detached, feverish with a cold, mathematical certainty. "A single variable in a system that is already balancing toward zero. You think of individual breaths, Torin. You think like a mortal who sees only the tick of the second hand. Look at the clock. Look at the entire mechanism. I opened my eyes, gasping slightly as the air in the cave suddenly felt heavy, saturated with that cloying scent of lilies. I looked at Kaelen's back. He stood perfectly still, his shoulders squared, his gaze fixed on the dark basin beyond. He was so intensely, beautifully human. A man willing to die for an idea, for an oath, for a friend who was systematically betraying everything he stood for. "Kaelen," I said, my voice sounding cracked and dry in the quiet cave. He didn't move. He didn't turn his head. "Save your breath, Torin. You need to rest." "I need you to understand," I said, pushing myself up slightly, my fingers gripping the cold stone. "The transition. It isn't something I can control with logic. When the presence expands, my own thoughts they are shoved aside. I am an observer in my own skin." Kaelen was silent for a long moment, the only sound the soft, distant whistle of the wind through the canyon. When he finally spoke, his voice was cracked with an ancient, heavy exhaustion. "When you were High Cleric, Torin, you told me that a man's vows are his skin," he said, his words slow and deliberate. "You said that if a man lets his vows tear, he has no structure left to hold his soul. Now you tell me you are a passenger. You tell me a monster is wearing your skin, and you expect me to just follow you into the dark." "I don't expect you to follow me," I said, the intellectual clarity of my old life returning for a brief, agonizing second. "I am telling you that the structure we built in Dawnspire was already dead. The entity. It is showing me the rust, Kaelen. It is showing me that the law is just a cage we built because we were terrified of the sky." Kaelen finally turned around. His face was entirely in shadow, but I could see the glint of his eyes, cold and dark. "The cage kept people safe, Torin. The law kept that child fed. If your new world requires us to burn the grain and liquefy the earth, then your new world is a slaughterhouse." He turned back to the dark basin, his posture rigid, ending the conversation with the absolute finality of an iron gate slamming shut. I sank back against the stone wall, my hands trembling in my lap. I looked down at my fingertips, which still held that faint, bruised violet hue under the fingernails. I wanted to apologize. I wanted to tell him that I was terrified, that I missed the ledger entries and the quiet security of my desk. But as I closed my eyes, the entity shifted in my mind, a sudden, cold surge of dopamine washing through my nervous system, easing the ache in my limbs and replacing my human fear with a terrible, weightless certainty. "Let him watch the basin," the patron whispered, its voice now entirely indistinguishable from my own deepest thoughts. "Let him guard the dead world. The road to the abyssal gate is already open, and he is already walking it. He just hasn't realized that the gears have stopped." I fell into a fitful, dreamless sleep, the taste of copper thick on my tongue, while outside the cave the moon rose over the wastes, casting long, geometric shadows that looked exactly like the bars of a cage.